Welcome to Adapters Advantage, breakthrough moments that lead to success. Our podcast brings you insider stories of the moments that mattered, turning points on the sometimes rocky road to success. Here's your host, Mark Magnacca, president and co-founder of Allego, the workforce training and readiness platform built for distributed teams.
Hi, I'm Mark Magnacca, and I want to welcome you to our next episode of the Adapters Advantage podcast. I'm excited to have as my guest, Jesse Jackson of JPMorgan Chase. Before we get started, I want to give you a brief bio that I'm going to read of Jesse. So Jesse serves as the firm-wide head of learning and talent solutions for JPMorgan Chase. His responsibilities include the management, direction, and strategy of this corporate function. This globally distributed and high-impact learning organization supports more than 240,000 bank employees worldwide, in addition to developing learning content for strategic vendors. Jesse's been with the firm for over 25 years, joining the bank via the firm's management development program after completing 5 years of active duty in the United States Navy. He's also held several national leadership roles within commercial banking and business banking, serving as the National Client Service Executive. And then lastly, Jesse resides in Long Island, New York, with his wife, Yasmin, and his son, Jonathan. So Jesse, welcome to the podcast.
Pleasure to be with you here today. Thank you very much for having me, Mark.
Jesse, when I think about your story, there's a lot of unique elements here that we're going to get to. But the first one is when I think about even that title, and when you meet people and they ask you about what do you do, how do you answer the question, what do you do?
Mark, thank you for the question. I answer it pretty simply. Frankly, all that I do is really help individuals achieve escape velocity. And by helping individuals become the best version of themselves by virtue of elevating their contribution to the business, we're able to really level up how we perform as an enterprise. And by ensuring that we have a very specific engagement plan for employees globally that are myopically aligned with helping them become more successful at what it is they are doing, we're really able to achieve multiple goals. One, helping the individual become successful, helping the business become successful, but equally important, ensuring that we're not just investing in jobs, but really providing careers for our employees globally.
Well, I love the framework of escape velocity as a metaphor. Because sort of staying with it, I think it's 17,500 miles per hour, but when you get to a certain speed, right, you can break free, and that breaking free can be of sort of mental constraints that you have. So there's a lot that we can work with respect to that. And maybe that's a great segue, Jesse, to the idea. I know I've read about this in other articles that mentioned this notion of you being the accidental CLO. And I know in particular, there was a CLO magazine article with that title, and they described you as in that way because you didn't come up with what we'll call the quote normal HR program. So the question is, how has this different approach helped you with employees as it relates to understanding what they need on their learning path across the different lines of businesses that you support?
Bringing a different perspective to what it is I do has really afforded me a huge advantage. And we understand organizationally, we understand individually that if we have diversified portfolios, they generally perform better, they're generally safer. We understand also that bringing sort of diversity of thought to the type of complicated problems that we face as organizations, that again, we're able to be more innovative, more adaptive. As I think about growing up in multiple lines of businesses, in understanding what we refer to as KPIs or key performance indexes, and understanding how those business objectives truly ladder into individual objectives. As a learning organization, as a learning leader, equips one with an ability to be much more surgical with respect to the level of precision we need to deliver in order to ensure that our educational interventions, that our experiential interventions are landing well with respect to those employees that we have a privilege to serve globally. And then as I think about this notion of accidental CLO, it really also has, the perspective that I didn't choose this profession as much as this profession chose me. In as much as it's one that certainly I bring a lot of passion and energy to, with a real focus on helping employees, truly enhance their contribution. And by helping them enhance their contribution, helping them attain levels of success, that allow them to reimagine their career trajectory and reimagine, the various skills, that they could mature, to go into a number of directions that are fully accretive to, how we have to deliver value, to our clients. And equally important, how we need to be adaptive in this age of acceleration that we live through. And in many respects, as a result of COVID, has further, increased in terms of its velocity.
Well, Jesse, what's interesting as I'm listening to you, I can't help but think, I realize you haven't done every job in the bank, but when I think about the jobs that you have done, both starting as a teller, being in management, and being in the commercial bank, really across the gamut. The question I have for you is, because I've spoken with a number of other CLOs, that sometimes the challenge they face is if they don't come from the business, it's hard to connect deeply to what's it like to be trying to learn as you're coming up through these different roles. So as I think about what informs your thinking, how much has been, for example, the frustration of trying to log into a certain system when you were in the commercial bank or when you were in the community bank? How much does that inform your thought process as you work at the scale that you're in now?
In many respects, those formative experiences, that I had were just so impactful in laying a foundation of, better understanding, what excellent training looks like and, what excellent training doesn't look like. And as I think about my navigation, through, teletraining, just to pull a bit on the string, that you've outlined, I want to say a couple of things. One, I still have my teller certificate framed and on the wall here in my office as I work from home, because I take a lot of pride, in being able to navigate teletraining. But what it did tell me is that it did not try to teach me or those individuals that were part of my teletraining class how to go through transaction processing via a textbook or via a lecture. It was practical, hands-on, repetitive engagement over several weeks, if one can believe that. To really ensure that as we put ourselves in front of customers to perform transactions, as pedestrian as those transactions may be, that we were really preparing individuals for those experiences, what they would encounter, what those end cases might be, how to handle not just the transactional element, but also the experiential element of customer being at the window with a check that might require additional approval or authorization in order to transact. And as I reflect on those experiential elements, it really has informed me that that has to be a part of ensuring employees are ready to perform those tasks. many of them fairly complex, that we ask them to do globally. And incorporating, that type of experiential elements within any type of training is critical.
It's so interesting as you're saying this, Jesse, because you're sparking several different ideas. I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges exist in learning in general is so much of our learning is informed from the academic model. And as you well know, many of us, myself included, don't learn best just from a book or just from sitting in a classroom in a one-way communication. That word you just used, experiential, that's my learning strategy. I need to do it. You want me to process the check? Show me how to do it and then let me do it. That's how I learn. So something that occurred to me as you were talking about, I couldn't help but think about how in the US Navy, we take 18 and 19-year-old young people, we put them on nuclear-powered submarines and aircraft, and we basically have them doing some of the most complex work that you can do, many of whom have just come from high school or attained a GED. What was your role in the Navy, and how did that impact you as you moved into the private sector?
Wow, you're really taking me back now, Mark. So thank you for that. But as you do take me back, it's one to very positive experiences. As I think about the time that I've had the privilege to serve the country, being in the United States Navy, it really is an example of experiential training squared, if not cubed, in terms of the type of repetition that certainly is demanded, the time that individuals spend with you to not just teach you but to observe you. It's almost a mentorship type of a process, an apprenticeship process where there is truly a premium put on ensuring that individuals have deep domain understanding of those processes. And that takes time. It takes repetition, and it takes an investment in individuals to really ensure that they can become expert, at those type of tasks that they are being asked to operationalize. So as I think about certainly my experience moving through boot camp, my experience moving through other elements of training, it really provided a foundation that I thought was very portable to the commercial sector, in as much as when you're in the military, you don't necessarily have the same type of conventional weekends that one may have in the commercial sector. And more specifically, having been deployed on ships in the Middle East, having spent over a year in Keflavik, Iceland, in many respects, it really allows individuals more time to become proficient, but it's also instructive because it informs you that if you put in the time, you really can sort of master the craft to a differentiated degree.
Jesse, I tell you, I'm so glad that you just shared that piece. There's so much in that. In particular, even just as you were talking about it, and I was thinking about you being on a ship, I was thinking of being in Iceland. So yeah, there's time, there may be time to study and time to learn, but inherently what I'm realizing is the notion of peer-based learning is fundamental in the military. Who are you learning from? Another young person. You're not learning from a general, you're learning from someone maybe one rank above you.
You're spot on, Mark. That experiential learning is critical. And as I reflect on that now, some 30 years later, the tools that we have to deploy sort of that experience-based learning, the tools that we have to illustrate in high fidelity what excellence looks like, permeate our environment, and our ability to operationalize those tools in a way that are helping individuals become more proficient at their craft will really allow us to truly reimagine what success looks like for that individual, but also for the enterprise that those individuals serve.
Well, let's use that as a transition to talk about transition, the notion of transition, if you will. And the question is, can you describe a personal pivot point or a moment of learning that changed your approach to your role?
And there are so many, so many still that I trip across in many cases every day. But sometimes they're the small things, very small. Probably 7 years ago, I remember, being in the Midwest, going in to, observe a class, that we were facilitating for managers. At the end of the day, I stayed back to talk with, some of our facilitators. And again, this is a very small, very pedestrian, but it was also very instructive. And one of the things that I noticed is that, as a class of, let's call it, 30 employees were leaving, they were taking our 3-ring binders, and they were taking the material out of the 3-ring binders. They were chucking them in the garbage. Being sort of commercially focused, I'm thinking, you know what, I pay like, $3-4 for the binders, another, a couple of bucks to have the paper put in it, another couple of bucks to have it shipped, to these locations where we had historically centralized and done some of our training. And it was like a light bulb that went off. That's it. Why are we doing all of that if when these young adults leave, they just throw it in the garbage? And it's not that they did not value the training.
Yeah.
I just don't believe that they valued the modality in which we were delivering that training to them. And it was really at that moment that I said, we need to change sort of how we show up, right? And being much more, employee centric, if you will, and understanding that in many respects, we have millennial majorities, individuals that have grown up on digital, iPads or tablet devices or phones in terms of how they consume information, yet we're giving them binders and papers where they don't need it, or nor do they want it, right? So it really was a very instructive pivot for me to really say we need to do something different if we want to connect with folks more effectively. And by the way, if we want to bring our costs down in terms of how we deliver what it is we do.
Yeah, that's a wonderful twofer. And Jesse, what's really ironic of being of roughly the same vintage here, I am a 3-ring binder guy. Probably from your time, even in the Navy, like I learned things were operationalized in a 3-ring binder, right? I got the 3-ring binder, you got new operating procedures. Like I learned from this book called The E-Myth, how to operationalize my business using, binders. And so what a great example of a certain generation being comfortable with a particular modality and then not realizing, because I had the exact same thing happen at some classes I was teaching, but it was for a different reason. It wasn't even that they were throwing the whole thing out. It was all these people were traveling. So they would be traveling to the class. So they would take the stuff out of the 3-ring binder, stick the papers in their briefcase, and then leave. And the same epiphany occurred to me, which is, why are we giving it to them? Oh, that's because I like it. That's why we're doing it.
So true, so true. And I would also say that given the velocity of change now, that material that we're printing and we're giving it to them, by the time those planes land back wherever they're going, we need to update it. So it really served multiple purposes to just get out of the printing and shipping business and really figuring out how do we show up more digitally.
Well, let's go from that, but that's a great segue to this notion of digitalization. And one of the questions I want to ask you is, what's the biggest change that's occurred from your perspective in terms of how people are learning at JP Morgan Chase since the start of the pandemic?
In many respects, as I think about, the biggest change, it also is a bit of a paradigm shift, right? And part of the paradigm shift, and maybe this is more me, is this notion that, pre-pandemic, I was under sort of a belief that speed kills, right? We see it on the highway, the signs, slow down, speed, speed kills. What I've certainly come to grips with is that speed can save our lives, and nowhere was that more sort of illustrated than our ability to move to a work from home posture and really over-index on employee and customer safety as we think about what's happened as a result of COVID. And in many respects, it also meant that I needed to accelerate, how we ensure everything is digital for everyone that we need to engage. And not just digital, but high fidelity, right? So really ensuring that we're being much more intentional with respect to the curation of the different types of learning that we're doing, the surgical precision of how we administer that to the job families that we have the privilege of caring for. And that required not just speed, but it really required, a level of specificity that allowed us, to really ensure that even with this disruptive change in our global economy, that we're able to support, our clients, support our employees without disruption.
Jesse, I'm going to feed a line back to you here. You talked about how you initially had this, I'll call it a filter that speed kills. And the beauty of your metaphor of helping employees reach escape velocity is that if you're not going fast enough, you can't break free.
That's right.
Right. So that's a great segue to the next point I wanted to talk to you about, because it was back in 2018. So clearly well before the pandemic. And I read, quote, you were leading this charge to reconstitute your curriculum and ensure you're incorporating digital modalities. The point you were just making, including remote learning, video-based tools. And so I'm curious, at the management committee level, when Jamie Dimon and others look around and they see that you have the equivalent of a country, literally like a small country, that is moved to working remotely in every part of the world. What do they say about how quickly this enormous firm has adapted?
In many respects, it is because of our leaders, within our enterprise that, have really incorporated within our DNA, this notion of being employee-centric, of being customer-centric, of really ensuring that we were adaptive and resilient with respect to how we show up. I believe, not only allowed us to have a competitive advantage ahead of this pandemic, but has allowed us to extend that competitive advantage during the pandemic. And in many respects, what we're all learning, is this is not sort of a light switch you can turn on and off. These are capabilities, these are competencies that need to be deeply instilled, in the culture, of an organization, as we think about resiliency, as we think about the teamwork, the partnership, the collaboration, what some may call soft skills, that are even more critical, even more of a premium, as we think about how do we still stay connected, even while we are truly globally distributed, not in massive offices because of de-densification, but really within the context of our home, relying on Wi-Fi or some other, bandwidth to stay connected, to help us drive continuous value, to our employees, but ultimately to those customers that we truly have a privilege to care for.
It's a very, very interesting point. And I think about, as someone who's watched JPM for a long time, the ability to make this pivot. I guess once you have the systems in place, then whether there's 25,000 people or there's 250,000 people, the planning that you just talked about, the ability to execute, it's just the next order of magnitude. And yet, I know from my conversations with other CLOs, there's this struggle with demonstrating the value of L&D. And so my question is, how have you accelerated the value that the L&D function itself provides across the organization? And what, if any, suggestions do you have for other leaders who are looking to model some of the things that may have worked for you?
Yeah, in many respects, Mark, that question takes me back to one of the first or second questions you asked me in terms of those perspectives that I'm able to bring into the L&D function as a result of being business aligned for the majority of my career. In my early days within the learning organization, we, like I'm sure many of our colleagues, leverage smile sheets, or what I refer to as an L1 survey. Do I enjoy the training? Yes, no, maybe so. As a way of measure, but there's really marginal value there, right? And where the real value comes, not just for us, but I think for all of our colleagues, within learning and development, is really ensuring that those metrics that we use to measure success are the same measures of our business colleagues, right? If we are attempting to enhance controls, we should understand exactly what those control elements are at a submolecular level and ensure that those individuals that are moving through the training are able to deliver more effective measures on those basis of the business metrics as individuals that may not have gone through those training interventions. Same thing for service, same thing for sales, right? We really need to ensure that those metrics that we are leveraging as success indicators really ladder into what the business is measuring. And that way we're able to talk to them, not with our arcane KPIs or key performance indexes, but precisely with what it is they are targeting to measure, to improve, as well as to elevate across their enterprises.
You know what, Jesse, that is, it's so simple what you've just described, but it's so true that for too often, the L&D function has had, whether it was the smile sheets or even, a more recent version of that, some way of measuring that did not align. I'll just use the sales function as an example. If the training that's being done for salespeople and the measurement thereof does not align to the way the sales management is going to actually assess the performance of the salespeople, then by definition, you're setting up a problem.
That's right.
Right? So this just the notion of, but inherent in what you've just described, you have to both care and want to get into the molecular level of detail to truly understand the business so that you can come back. And by the way, the result of that dialogue may be that they need to tweak the way they are measuring because it may not be scalable. It may not be, so it's a dialogue. But the fact that you want to engage and are thinking about it, that in and of itself is a unique way of thinking that has not been the coin of the realm, if you will, across L&D.
Very true, Mark.
So just time for just two or more questions. I'm interested in your point of view in particular on this notion of lifelong learning, or what some call learning agility. and thinking strategically about the learning modalities that you're maturing kind of across this large enterprise. So first, what do you think about when asked the idea of going to school, you sort of finished your learning and now you're in your job? Is that way of thinking the future, or is that way of thinking need to be adapted?
Without question, and it's a loaded question because you know the answer to that better than I, Mark. And I think everyone that's listening to this podcast, everyone that's a Lego sort of client, or associate, understands that lifelong learning, truly is, the currency of the future, right? As we think about, how do you future-proof a career? You future-proof a career by really ensuring that we are stepping outside of the echo chambers that we live in, the echo chambers sometimes that we work in, to really understand, what does innovation look like? How can innovation help support, accelerate the speed in which we operate, the speed in which we drive value across, our remits, whether broad, narrow, or wide, and really ensuring, how that becomes more of a life skill, that, truly embodies who we are. Right now, the half-life of skills, are, about, the duration of a goldfish's memory. And, our ability to really ensure that by virtue of, those capabilities that we have as learning executives, that we're helping individuals become better every day, every week, every month, and that we can measure that as part of our quarterly business reporting elements, become critical to our survival as individuals as well as organizations.
So future-proofing your career, that's a great tagline from what you've just described. And so if someone was asking within the employee base of JP Morgan Chase, what's the one skill? If I was going to focus on one skill, based on what I'm hearing from you, is that skill, in a sense, the skill to adapt and continuing to learn? Or is there some other skill, if you had to focus on one thing in the context of future-proofing your career?
It's always a challenge. And, as I think about sort of what is the tall pole in the tent, which is essentially, your question, I think it goes back to, what it is you said, right? And you've termed it, both lifelong learning as well as learning agility. I would argue, it's different sides of the same coin. But that ability to not just be a lifelong learner, not just to illustrate learning agility, it's also to ensure that you're operationalizing what you learn. We know as L&D professionals that data is not enough to change behavior, right? It's not data alone. It really becomes these experiential elements that you talked so eloquently about earlier in our conversation today. And how do we actually blend those items together in a way that really wins the hearts and the minds of those employees, those individuals that our educational interventions touch.
Well, Jesse, this has really been a great conversation. I'm grateful for the time to just get to know you and hear your point of view on these topics. If our listeners want to learn more about you or be able to follow some of the thought leadership your team helps to put out, what's the best way for people to do that?
I think like everyone else on social media, they can certainly find me, on LinkedIn. And certainly we would encourage anyone to please visit our corporate website. There's so much information about the great work that our firm is doing, both in the financial sector as well as our very robust corporate responsibility framework.
Wonderful. Well, Jesse, thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Mark, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure being with you today.
Thanks for joining us this week on Adapters Advantage, available on all major podcast platforms. Make sure you visit our website, allego.com, where you can subscribe to our podcast so you'll never miss an episode. If you liked this show, you might want to check out our virtual training kit to learn how to keep a remote team running at full speed. Go to allego.com/virtual to download your kit today. Be sure to tune in for our next episode. And don't forget, one new idea can change your life.